Rome occupied Britain for nearly 400 years, longer than the entire history of the United States. They built London, Bath, and York. They paved thousands of miles of roads. At its peak, 55,000 Roman soldiers garrisoned the island. And yet, when geneticists decoded the DNA of modern British people, they found something that should be impossible. Almost no Roman genetic signature, anywhere. The most powerful empire the ancient world ever produced ruled this island for 4 centuries and left virtually no trace in the blood of its people. How does that happen? The answer isn't just about Rome. It's about a chain of genetic replacements, some violent, some silent, stretching back thousands of years before Caesar ever crossed the English Channel. And to understand it, we need to start at the very beginning. Nor around 4000 BC, Neolithic farmers began arriving in Britain. They came from Anatolia, modern Turkey, part of a slow agricultural revolution sweeping across Europe. They cleared forests, planted crops, built permanent settlements, and over 1500 years constructed the first phases of Stonehenge. But here's what ancient DNA revealed. These farmers didn't coexist peacefully with the people already there. Britain's original inhabitants, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who'd lived on the island since the last ice age, were almost entirely replaced. Not through war, but through slow demographic pressure. More food, more children, more villages. Generation by generation, the farmers expanded and the hunters vanished. And those original hunter-gatherers? In 2018, scientists extracted DNA from Cheddar Man, Britain's oldest complete skeleton, roughly 10,000 years old. The results stunned everyone. He had blue eyes and dark to black skin. The first Britons looked nothing like the people who live there today. So the Neolithic farmers replaced the hunter-gatherers, remade Britain, and built Stonehenge. For over 1,000 years, they were the people of this island. But they wouldn't last either. Around 2500 BC, a new people arrived, carrying bronze, horses, and a bloodline from the Eurasian steppes. They're called the Beaker People, and their roots trace back to nomadic herders called the Yamnaya. In 2018, a landmark study in Nature, the largest ancient DNA study of its time, analyzed 400 prehistoric skeletons. The finding for Britain was devastating. At least 90% of the island's genetic ancestry was replaced within just a few centuries. The people who built Stonehenge were almost completely erased from the gene pool, and, hauntingly, the Beaker arrivals showed up just after the last great stones went up. The people who finished using the monument were almost entirely different from those who started building it. The Beakers also transformed what the British looked like. The Neolithic farmers had olive skin, dark hair, and brown eyes. The Beaker migrants brought genes for lighter skin, blue eyes, and fair hair, the features we associate with the British today. Those traits didn't come from the Romans or Saxons. They came from these Bronze Age steppe migrants 4,500 years ago. And this Beaker ancestry became the deep genetic bedrock of Britain, and it was already ancient by the time Rome arrived 3,000 years later. That's the first clue to why Roman DNA never took hold. In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius launched the invasion, 4 legions, roughly 40,000 men. Within decades, Roman towns rose across Britain. But here's what most people miss. Rome never colonized Britain the way modern empires colonized continents. There was no mass settlement of Italian families. The garrison peaked at about 55,000 troops against a native population of 3 to 4 million. That's roughly 3%. A thin military crust over a vast native population. And those soldiers weren't genetically Roman in any meaningful sense. By the mid-2nd century, over 70% were auxiliaries recruited from across the empire: Gaul, Spain, Syria, North Africa. A Roman soldier buried in York might carry Middle Eastern DNA. The science confirms this. A 2016 study of Roman-era skeletons from York found that 6 out of 7 genomes matched modern Welsh and Celtic populations, native Britons, not Mediterranean immigrants. And a 2024 study of 33 Roman-era genomes from rural Cambridgeshire was titled simply "Low Genetic Impact of the Roman Occupation of Britain in Rural Communities." Rome gave Britain its roads, cities, laws, and language of power. but it never gave Britain its blood. Roman Britain was a cultural performance, a veneer. Underneath, the Beaker genetic bedrock remained untouched. Then, in 410 AD, Rome left. And what rushed in next would accomplish something Rome never could. When Rome withdrew, Britain collapsed. The administration dissolved. Towns went silent. And from across the North Sea came the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians. For decades, historians debated what happened. Was it a violent invasion or a small elite takeover? In 2022, the answer arrived. A massive study in Nature analyzed 460 ancient genomes. The result, in early medieval Eastern England, roughly 76% of genetic ancestry came from continental Northern Europe. This wasn't cultural diffusion. This was mass migration. Entire families, men, women, and children, crossing the North Sea and resettling. Some Anglo-Saxon burial sites look almost entirely continental European. The Celtic Britons, or whose DNA had survived 4 centuries of Roman rule completely intact, were now being displaced and pushed to the margins. The Anglo-Saxons achieved in 2 centuries what Rome couldn't in 4. They didn't just change the culture, they changed the blood, but not everywhere. In the mountains, the moors, the wild western fringes, the old blood held. The Welsh call themselves Cymri, meaning fellow countrymen, because for 1,500 years they've been the last of the original Britons. The 2015 People of the British Isles study confirmed it. The Welsh carry what may be the most ancient DNA in the UK, connecting them to populations thousands of years older than any invader. And here's the bitter irony. The word Wales comes from the Anglo-Saxon Wale, meaning foreigner. The original Britons, called foreigners in their own land, are in 865 AD, the great heathen army landed and carved out the Danelaw across northern and eastern England. For over a century, Scandinavian power reshaped the map. And yet, the people of the British Isles study found no distinct Danish Viking genetic cluster in modern England. The 2020 Cambridge Viking DNA study estimated only about 6% of the UK population carries Viking DNA. Real, but modest. The one exception: Orkney, where roughly 25% of the DNA is Norwegian Viking. But even there, 75% remained indigenous. And in a twist that mirrors the Roman story perfectly, male skeletons buried in Orkney with full Viking warrior gear were genetically not Scandinavian at all. They were genetically Irish and Scottish. Being a Viking, like being a Roman, was a cultural identity, not a bloodline. And then came 1066, William the Conqueror. The Norman Conquest changed everything about England: language, law, architecture, the class system. Everything except the DNA. William brought perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 followers into a country of nearly 2 million. The study's conclusion was direct. The Norman invasion involved a small ruling elite with limited influx of DNA. The event that most transformed English culture was genetically negligible. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Saxon migration, which most people barely think about, remains the single largest genetic transformation since the Bronze Age. The People of the British Isles project collected DNA from over 2,000 volunteers across rural Britain, each with all 4 grandparents born within 80 kilometers of each other. Using advanced statistical analysis, NASA researchers sorted the samples into genetic clusters purely by DNA similarity with no location data. When they plotted the results on a map, the correspondence was extraordinary. 17 distinct genetic clusters, and they aligned with the political boundaries of Anglo-Saxon England. The ancient kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Kent were still visible in the DNA of people living in those regions today. Devon and Cornwall split along the modern county line. North and South Wales divided along the borders of Gwynedd and Dyfed, borders drawn by warlords in the 6th century, still written in the cells of the living. And one final detail: no distinct Roman genetic cluster appeared anywhere, not one. 400 years of occupation, 0 identifiable genetic community. So while Anglo-Saxon signatures remain sharp enough to map onto a kingdom-by-kingdom grid, 1,500 years later, Britain's genetic story reveals something profound about identity itself. The histories nations build, the heroes they claim, the ancestors they celebrate, are almost never the biological reality running through their veins. What the British are, in overwhelming proportion, are the descendants of two groups most people have never heard of: Bronze Age Beaker, migrants from the Eurasian steppe, who arrived 4,500 years ago, and Anglo-Saxon farming families from northern Germany and Denmark, who arrived 1,500 years ago. Everything in between, Rome, the Vikings, the Normans, left culture, language, architecture, and law. But not blood. Somewhere in Britain right now, but there is a person whose mitochondrial DNA traces an unbroken maternal line back over 10,000 years, to one of the first humans who walked onto the island after the glaciers retreated. That lineage survived the Neolithic farmers, the Beaker wipeout, the Romans, the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, the Black Death, 2 world wars. She carries it in every cell of her body, and she has no idea.